Welcome back, friends. In this episode, we'll be listening to the story of Henry and Seraphina. Grab a cup of coffee and enjoy the story. Happy viewing. The coffee machine at Deepwell had a name, though Henry had never told anyone this, because there was no one to tell. He called it Gerald. Gerald wheezed when it worked and screamed when it didn't, and for the past 9 months it had been the only thing on the outpost that reliably answered when Henry spoke to it. This was not, he was aware, the sign of a man who was doing fine. "You're rationing me again," he told it, watching the sludge crawl into his cup. "I noticed. I want you to know I noticed." Gerald hissed something non-committal. Outside, the storm had been going for 11 days. Not a storm the way the recruitment hollows had meant it, back when the colony was young and the word carried a kind of romance to it. This was the other kind. The kind that peeled paint off the outer hull and threw ice against the windows like the planet had a personal grievance and intended to see it through. Deepwell sat at the last inhabited edge of a colony that everyone had quietly, politely agreed was finished. The other outposts had gone dark one by one, their people loaded onto departing ships, their lights winking out across the plain until only Henry's remained. A single stubborn ember refusing to admit the fire was over. He'd stayed because someone had to mind the relay. That was the official reason. The unofficial reason was harder to say out loud, even to Gerald. He was halfway through the coffee and most of the way through a losing argument with himself about whether to go to bed when the sky turned green. Not lightning. Henry knew lightning. Lightning was an old roommate by now. This was a single, sickly emerald streak that split the storm from horizon to horizon, too slow to be a meteor and far too bright to be anything friendly. It burned for 3 full seconds, long enough for him to stand, long enough to spill coffee down his front and not even feel it. And then something enormous came down in the ice fields with a sound like the planet clearing its throat. The whole outpost shuddered. A cup fell somewhere. Gerald screamed. "Okay," Henry said to the empty room very calmly, in the voice of a man whose calm was a thin sheet of ice over a very deep lake. "Okay, that's new, every sensible instinct he had, and he liked to think he had at least a few left, tucked away for emergencies. Told him to stay inside. The storm alone could kill a person out there in under an hour. Whatever had just fallen might finish the job faster. The proper procedure, the one stenciled on the wall in cheerful yellow letters, was to log the event, secure the outpost, and wait for daylight. Henry read the cheerful yellow letters. He put on his thermal suit. "This is a bad idea," he informed the letters. "I want it on the record that I know that." The walkout was a war. The wind shoved him sideways, then shoved him back, as if it couldn't decide which way it wanted him to die and was going to keep trying options. His helmet lamp caught nothing but streaking ice until, 2 kilometers out, the ground opened into a long black gouge, a wound in the plain, still steaming, and at the end of it, half buried, something that had once been a craft. It was beautiful, was the stupid thing. Even crumpled like a thrown-away thought, even smoking, it had lines to it that no human hand had drawn. Curves that seemed to apologize for existing. Henry stood at the lip of the crater with his heart doing something complicated, and told himself firmly that he would look and only look, and then he would go home and let the professionals handle it, whoever and whenever they turned out to be. Then his lamp found the shape inside. She was slumped against a console that had folded around her like it had tried, in its last moment, to hold her. Her skin was the pale, luminous blue of deep ice, the color the glaciers went at their oldest heart, and it was bleeding something that caught the light in a color he had no word for. Her ears tapered up into long, elegant points that his brain refused, flatly refused, to file under anything sensible, and simply left sitting in the middle of the floor for later. Henry did not think. Later he would be grateful for that, because if he'd thought, he might have been sensible. He climbed down into the wreck. He reached for her. Her eyes snapped open. They were not human eyes, and they did not look at him with anything he could name as fear. They tracked him, steadily, coldly, the way a general might assess a battlefield she had not chosen and did not much like the terms of. She was dying, and she was still, quite clearly, deciding whether he was worth the trouble of surviving. "Hi." Henry said, because it was that or scream, and his voice came out ridiculous and small under the howl of the wind. Sorry. You've had an accident. She kept looking at him. I'm one of the good ones, he added. Probably. Statistically. Getting her back to Deepwell was the hardest 2 kilometers of Henry's life, and he had once carried a broken compressor the same distance uphill, which he'd previously considered his personal benchmark for suffering. She wasn't heavy. She weighed almost nothing, in fact, less than a person her size had any right to, as if her bones were built for a lighter world than this one. But she kept fading in and out, and every time she faded she went boneless, and every time she came back she tried to fight him. It made for an interesting rhythm. Carry, stagger, get elbowed, apologize to a semi-conscious alien, carry again. I'm helping, he kept saying into the wind, which swallowed it whole. This is help. This is what help looks like. I know it's confusing. He kicked the airlock open and got her inside, and the storm sealed out behind them, and the sudden quiet was so total it rang. He laid her on the table. His only good table. The one he'd been quietly saving for a nicer occasion that was, he'd known for months, never actually coming, and which he now ruined instantly and forever with a spreading stain of that impossible color. Then he stood there and confronted the fact that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Right, he said. Okay, first aid. I did the module. There was a module. The module, as far as Henry could recall, had been designed for humans, who were reassuringly full of the standard equipment in the standard places. This woman was full of he had no idea, arranged he knew not how, and leaking a substance his med scanner cheerfully labeled unknown before giving up and displaying a small, confused question mark, which Henry felt summed up the situation with real economy. He narrated to himself as he worked, low and steady, the way you'd talk while diffusing something. We're going to clean this. Just clean it. Cleaning is safe. Everybody likes cleaning. I'm going to touch your arm now, and I want you to understand that I mean nothing by it. Her eyes opened. Then her hand closed around a jagged piece of what had, until quite recently, been Gerald. The storm's impact had flung the coffee machine's guts halfway across the room, and she brought the sharp end up to Henry's throat with a speed that a dying woman should not have been able to manage. Henry went very still. So, he said carefully, you're feeling better. She stared at him over the improvised blade, chest heaving, her strange eyes flicking around the room, cataloging exits, weighing him, working out the shape of the trap she assumed she was in. He could see the exact moment the calculation ran into a wall, because a flicker of confusion crossed her face. There was no trap. There was just a small, ugly room, a broken machine, a spreading stain, and a large, anxious man with his hands raised, wearing a shirt he'd spilled coffee on hours ago and never changed. That, Henry said, nodding very slightly toward the shard in her hand, is Gerald. Was Gerald. You're, and I say this with total respect, threatening me with a coffee machine. I just want you to have the full picture. She did not lower it, but she didn't push it forward either. They stayed like that for a while. Henry had time to notice that his knees hurt, that the storm was picking back up, and that he was strangely, stupidly unafraid, which he suspected said less about the situation than about how long it had been since anything had happened to him at all. Look, he said finally, you're bleeding. I don't know what that stuff is, and neither, frankly, does my scanner, but there's a lot less of it in you than there was an hour ago, and that seems bad in any language. I can help. Or you can hold that to my neck until we both fall asleep, and honestly, given the week I'm having, I might just take the nap. Something in his tone got through. Not the words, he thought, but the shape of them, the tiredness under them. Slowly, watching him the entire time, she lowered the shard. She didn't drop it. She set it down beside her, within reach, which Henry decided to interpret as an enormous compliment. He finished cleaning the wound in silence, and she let him, tense as a drawn wire, tracking his every movement. When he pushed a ration bar and a cup of water across the table toward her, she didn't touch either. She waited. She watched him, pointedly, unmistakably, until, understanding, He sighed, tore off a piece of the bar himself, and ate it in front of her. See, not poison, just terrible. Only then did she eat, carefully, mimicking him, testing the whole world one small motion at a time. He said something then, some throwaway grumble about how the bar tasted like the box it came in and possibly the box was the more nutritious half-key, and she laughed. Just once, quiet, almost involuntary, there and gone. And that, more than the blade at his throat, more than the blue of her skin or the impossible ship in the ice, was the thing that unsettled him, because it meant she'd understood, and it meant that somewhere behind those cold, assessing eyes, someone was in there, listening, and had decided, just for a second, that he was funny. Henry sat back down across from her, and neither of them said anything, and the storm went on and on outside like it had nowhere better to be. The nights at Deepwell were long, genuinely long, the planet's slow, tired rotation dragging each one out past any reasonable length. And long nights, Henry had learned over his months of solitude, made a person talk. He'd talk to Gerald. He'd talk to the walls, the storm, the little confused question mark on his med scanner. Now, for the first time in longer than he wanted to measure, he had something that might talk back, and he found he didn't quite know how to begin. She solved it for him. On the third night, sitting up now, her wound closed into a seam of paler blue, she watched him lose an argument with the ration heater and said, in careful, deliberate human words, "You speak to objects." Henry nearly dropped the heater. "You speak," he said. "You've been, this whole time you could. Some." She held her thumb and finger a small distance apart, the gesture unmistakable across any gulf of species. "Enough to know you are strange. That's rich," Henry said, coming from the woman with the ears, and immediately braced for the shard to reappear. It didn't. She almost smiled instead. Her name came later that same night, offered quietly across the table like a small object she wasn't sure she wanted to part with. "Seraphina," she said. Henry repeated it. And in the repeating, he watched something flicker over her face, a flinch, barely there, a hesitation quickly folded away, that told him with complete certainty that this was not the name she'd been born with. It was a name shaped for his mouth, something smoothed down and made pronounceable, a courtesy extended, a door held open just a hand's width. Her real name, he understood, was somewhere behind it, and she was not offering that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He didn't push. He'd spent his whole life on the receiving end of people pushing. Recruiters, administrators, the endless cheerful voices that had promised this colony would be paradise and then quietly evacuated it. And he'd learned that the fastest way to close a door was to lean on it. "Seraphina," he said again gently, like he was setting the name down somewhere safe. "It suits you." "It does not," she said, "but it is kind of you to lie." So they talked, across the long nights, in the small, warm circle of the outpost's one working lamp. Henry told her about the colony, how it had glittered in the brochures, how his family had come chasing that glitter and found dust, how the ships had started leaving and never quite stopped, one outpost going dark after another until the plain outside his window was a graveyard of other people's abandoned dreams. He told it lightly, made jokes of the worst parts because that was how he'd survived it. She listened in a way no one had listened to him in years, completely, without waiting for her turn to speak. She gave him less, and she gave it carefully. Her craft had been far from anywhere, farther than it should have been, and when he asked why, she went quiet in a way that had edges to it. She spoke around the question, never through it. He learned she'd been traveling a long time. He learned she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. He did not learn what she was running from, though by the third night he was certain she was running from something, because people who weren't running didn't flinch at their own names. What she gave him instead was the sky. He'd spread his old star charts across the table one night, the brittle laminated maps he'd squinted at for years, and she'd gone still over them the way a musician goes still hearing a song they know played wrong. "This is incorrect," she said. That's a certified colonial survey chart, Henry said, wounded on the chart's behalf. It is incorrect. She touched a cluster he'd always thought of privately as the kettle for its vaguely spout-like shape. These are not where you have drawn them. And this one, her finger drifted to a star he'd never bothered to name, a dim thing at the map's edge. This one is dead. It has been dead for longer than your colony has existed. You are looking at a light that stopped being sent a very long time ago. Henry looked at the little dead star he'd ignored his whole life, still shining stubbornly on his chart, still shining stubbornly in his sky, and felt something turn over in his chest. She kept going. She named systems he'd only ever seen as anonymous dots, and she named them the way you'd name old friends, with familiarity, with weariness, with here and there a flicker of something that might have been fondness and might have been grief. She traced routes between them with one blue finger, casual, offhand, as though describing streets in a town she'd grown up in. She knew things about those stars that Henry, who had spent his whole life beneath them, could never learn from any chart, any module, any human hand. "How do you know all this?" he asked, very quietly, afraid the question would close the door. Seraphina's finger stilled on the map. For a moment she looked not at the chart, but through it, out past the laminate and the outpost and the storm, to something enormously far away. "Because I have been there," she said, "and because I can never go back." Then she folded her hands, and the door closed, gently, and Henry knew better than to lean on it. Outside, the dead star went on shining, sending down a light that had stopped meaning anything a long time ago, and Henry thought that he understood that star a little better than he had that morning. The main console at Deepwell had been dying for years, and Henry had long since made his peace with it the way you make peace with a relative you love but can't stand. It sat against the far wall, a slab of ancient colonial engineering, and on its best days it managed a distress relay strong enough to whisper toward the rescue lanes that threaded the system. On its worst days, most days, it flickered, sulked, and displayed error codes that had not appeared in any manual since before Henry was born. He had stopped trying to fix it around the same time he'd started naming coffee machines. It was Seraphina who brought it back to life. Or rather, she looked at it one night, tilted her head and said, "This is not dead. It is only badly organized," in the exact tone a person might use about a room he hadn't cleaned. "That console," Henry said, "has defeated 3 certified technicians and one very confident man from a supply ship who said, and I quote, 'Oh, I've seen these before.' Then they were also badly organized." So they worked on it. Night after long night, bent together in the console's sick blue glow, and Henry discovered that Seraphina approached broken machines the way she approached everything, with a cold, patient competence that made him feel like a child holding a wrench for the grown-ups. She would name a component he'd never had a word for, and he'd hand her the nearest thing that matched the gesture, and about a third of the time he'd be right, which she seemed to find genuinely impressive, in the way one might be impressed by a dog that fetched the correct newspaper. Not that one. "You pointed. I pointed there." She indicated a spot 2 centimeters over. "You have brought me the wrong wire with great confidence." Confidence is 90% of the job. It's how humans got to space. "It is how you fell out of it," she said, taking the wrong wire from him anyway and using it. The work brought them close in a way the talking never had. Talking had a table between it. This had none. They knelt side by side in the narrow space behind the console, and their hands met over the same flickering panel more times than either of them acknowledged. And every time it happened, Henry felt something tighten in the air, some unspoken thing pulling taut between them, and every time he told himself it was the cold. Deepwell was always cold. That was surely all it was. Seraphina worked with her sleeves pushed up and her strange bright eyes narrowed in concentration, and Henry, holding the light for her, found himself watching her hands instead of the panel more often than was useful. She knew things about signal and starlight that he could never learn. Could look at a tangle of colonial wiring and see, underneath it, The pure, clean logic of how a signal wanted to move, the way water knows downhill. Watching her coax coherence out of the ruined console was like watching someone read aloud from a language written across the entire sky, fluent and unhurried, in no rush to explain it to the illiterate man beside her. "Your technology has no elegance," she informed him around midnight, splicing something. "It is all shouting. It solves every problem by shouting louder." "It has character," Henry said, wounded again on behalf of his species. "Its character," Seraphina said, "is going to get us both killed." And Henry laughed so hard he dropped the light. And in the dark, briefly, before he found it again, he was very aware of how close she was and how quiet she'd gone. They found the light. They kept working. Neither of them said anything about the dark. It happened on the 9th night, or the 10th. Henry had lost the thread of counting, which was its own quiet kind of confession. Seraphina touched two things together that he would not have dreamed of touching together. The console shuddered, coughed, and then, for the first time in years, its screen resolved into something clean. A steady tone filled the room. On the display, a green line reached up and out, strong and unbroken, hunting across the dark toward the rescue lanes. A working signal. A real one. Loud enough to be heard. They should have celebrated. Henry had imagined this moment for months, back when it had only ever been a fantasy. The console fixed, the call answered, the long ordeal ending. He'd pictured himself whooping. He'd pictured relief. Instead, they both went very still, kneeling there shoulder to shoulder in the blue light, watching that green line climb steadily into the dark. And Henry understood, could feel Seraphina understanding it too, in the sudden stiffness of her, exactly what a working signal meant. It meant someone would come. It meant this, the long nights, the small warm room, the shard she no longer reached for, the hands meeting over the panel. All of it had just been given an ending, and neither of them, he realized with a lurch, had wanted one. "Well," Henry said finally, into the humming quiet. His voice came out rougher than he'd meant it. "Guess it worked." "Yes," Seraphina said. She did not look away from the climbing green line. "Guess it did." Neither of them moved to turn it off. Neither of them moved at all. Outside, the storm had finally, for the first time in 12 days, begun to ease, and through the window a few hard stars showed through the thinning cloud. And somewhere out there, Henry knew now, a signal was climbing toward them, carrying the end of everything he hadn't known he wanted to keep. The signal was answered on the second night, and Henry's first mistake was assuming that answered meant rescued. He was asleep in the chair. He'd taken to sleeping in the chair, an arrangement he refused to examine, since the chair happened to face the room where Seraphina slept and the bed happened to face a wall, when the console woke him. Not the friendly tone of an open lane. Something sharper. A pulse, repeating, insistent, that put an ache behind his eyes before he was even fully awake. Seraphina was already at the screen. She'd gone completely still. That particular stillness he'd learned to read as the opposite of calm, and the light of the display painted her face a color he didn't like. "That's good, right?" Henry said, hauling himself upright, still half in a dream. "Somebody heard us. That's the whole." He stopped, because she'd turned to look at him, and whatever was in her face was not relief. "It is not your rescue," she said. "Okay, whose is it?" "Mine." Henry rubbed his eyes. "That's still good? Your people found you. You've been telling me for 2 weeks you're a long way from anywhere, and now—" "Henry." She said his name rarely, and it stopped him every time. "They are not looking for me to bring me home." And then, at last, the door she'd held shut for 2 weeks came open, not gently, the way she'd opened the small ones, but all at once, because there was no longer time to be careful. She was not simply a traveler who'd wandered too far. She was someone whose absence mattered, someone whose presence in the wrong hands mattered more, carrying inside her knowledge of the stars that certain people would cross a great deal of empty space to control or to silence. She had run because staying meant becoming a thing that was used. She had come down at the edge of a dying human colony precisely because it was the last place anyone would think to look for her, and Deepwell's newly resurrected relay had just stood up in the middle of that empty dark, cleared its throat, and announced her exact location to the entire sky. "Ah," said Henry, in a very small voice. "The signal. The signal. The signal I made you fix." "The signal I fixed," Seraphina corrected, "because you kept handing me the wrong wire and I could not watch it anymore. This feels like a bad time to relitigate the wire thing." "It is always a good time," she said, but there was no bite in it, only a thin, brittle thing stretched over something much worse, and Henry understood that she was frightened. Properly frightened, for the first time since she'd held Gerald's remains to his throat. He should have been frightened too. He was, distantly, but underneath the fear was a discovery so sudden and so enormous that it nearly knocked the breath out of him. The realization that for 2 weeks he had been quietly, without permission, rearranging the entire architecture of his future around a woman he had only ever been supposed to keep alive until someone came to take her away. He'd stopped counting the nights. He'd started sleeping in a chair that faced her door. He'd fixed a console he could have left broken forever. And part of him, he saw this now, clearly, cruelly, had hoped the whole time that it wouldn't work. And now someone was coming, just not the someone either of them had wanted. "How long?" he asked. "Before they arrive?" Seraphina studied the pulse, the ache of it, translating it into distances he couldn't feel. "A day, perhaps less. Their ships are faster than yours." She glanced at him, dry even now. "Everything is faster than yours. You're going to keep doing that even while we're being hunted. Especially then." So they did the only thing there was to do, which was to try to make one wheezing outpost at the edge of nowhere look like something other than a defenseless tin can with 2 people inside it. It was, Henry would later admit, a deeply stupid afternoon. They rerouted power to lights that served no purpose except to look occupied. Seraphina rigged the relay to throw out a scatter of false signals, ghost outposts blooming across the plain, though she warned him they wouldn't fool anyone who looked twice. Henry, running low on ideas and high on adrenaline, dragged out the outpost's ancient perimeter drones, 3 of them, dented, 1 missing a leg, and set them patrolling, and named them, on the spot, Gerald II, Gerald III, and Kevin. "Kevin," Seraphina said. "Ran out of Geralds. He's the disappointing one." Underneath the scramble, though, ran the real weight, and they both felt it, and neither of them said it. Every ghost signal she rigged, every useless light he lit, was a way of not standing still long enough to say the thing that had been tightening in the air between them for 2 weeks, because standing still meant admitting that in a day or less, one of 2 things would happen. Either her people would take her, and the knowledge in her head, and whatever future Henry had been foolishly building around her, or his people would answer next, offer him a seat off this dying rock, and he would have to choose, out loud, in front of her, between the safety he'd wanted for years and the woman he'd known for 2 weeks. Neither of those was a future he could bear to look at directly, so he lit another light and checked on Kevin, and made a joke he didn't feel, and beside him Seraphina worked in silence, and the pulse on the console kept coming, closer each time, counting down a night that had suddenly become very short. They stopped pretending somewhere in the deepest hour of that last night. It happened without ceremony. The ghost signals were rigged. The useless lights were lit. Kevin was patrolling the west perimeter with his 3 good legs and his 1 bad attitude. And there was, quite simply, nothing left to do but wait. Her pursuers were closing. His rescue lanes had, cruelly, also stirred at last, a second signal answering from the human side of the dark, which meant that by morning everything would arrive at once, the wanted and the unwanted, tangled together over one small outpost. And in the gap before all of it, in the last quiet they would get, the 2 of them sat at the table that had a stain on it that would never come out, and stopped running. "I have been unfair to you," Seraphina said. "You threatened me with a coffee machine. That was hour 1. Everything since has been a real improvement." I gave you a name that was not mine. You gave me a name, I could say. There's a difference. I've got a tongue built for shouting, remember? Your ship's whole language is probably 3 notes and a smell." She almost laughed. Then she didn't, because she'd made a decision, and he watched her make it. Watched the last held door swing open, deliberately this time, chosen rather than forced. She spoke a word. It was not a word his ears were built to hold. It moved through registers his hearing only half caught, a sound like ice settling on a deep lake, like something enormous and far away turning over in its sleep. It landed in the small, warm room and hung there. And Henry understood that he had just been given the thing she had refused every person who had ever tried to take it from her. "That's you," he said quietly. "The real you. That is me. I can't pronounce that." "I know." Something eased in her face, something that had been clenched since the ice fields. "You will call me Seraphina, but now you will know what it stands in front of." Henry sat with that. It was, he understood, worth more than any confession of feeling could have been. Because feelings were cheap, feelings could be shouted, and she came from a people who did not shout. She had handed him the one thing that could be used against her, and she had done it on purpose on the last night when it could only mean trust and never leverage. So he gave her the true thing back, because it was all he had. "I have to tell you something, and it's going to sound sad, and I need you to not do the ears." She lifted an eyebrow. The ears stayed put. "For months I told myself I was staying to mind the relay, guarding the colony. Last man at his post. Very noble, terrible haircut." He turned his cup in his hands. "But the colony was already dead, Seraphina. It finished dying a long time before you fell out of the sky. I wasn't guarding anything. I was just the last person too stubborn to admit the funeral was over." He looked up. "I thought that was the thing I was afraid of losing. This rock. This job. Turns out the thing I'm afraid of losing is sitting across the table from me, drinking my terrible coffee, being rude about my wiring. Your wiring is genuinely bad. You're supposed to be moved." "I am moved," she said. "I am also correct. Both can be true." But her hand had come to rest on the table, halfway across, in the space where 100 times over the past weeks their hands had met over a flickering panel, and she had told herself, as he had told himself, that it was only the cold. He put his hand over hers. This time neither of them called it the cold. They didn't say anything else for a while. There was a great deal that could have been said, and none of it needed to be. And Henry had learned by now that the fastest way to close a door was to lean on it. So he simply sat there with his rough human hand over her cool blue one, and let the silence be the thing it was. The storm broke toward dawn. It had raged for the better part of 3 weeks, ever since the night the sky went green, and now, as if it too had run out of things to say, it simply thinned and faded and let go. The wind dropped, the ice stopped throwing itself at the window, and through the clearing cloud, one by one, the hard, bright stars came back. Seraphina's stars, the ones she'd named like old friends, the dead ones still shining stubbornly among the living. She rose and went to the window and looked up at them, and Henry came and stood beside her, and she named a few, quietly. For him, this one, that one, the route between, the way you'd point out streets in a town you were about to leave and never see again. "That is where they will come from," she said, indicating a patch of returning sky, cold and clear. "And that," she nodded to another quarter, "is where yours will come from. 2 doors, both opening at once. And in the middle," Henry said, "us and Kevin." "And Kevin," she agreed gravely. Light was coming back to a sky that would not be empty much longer. Somewhere out past the thinning cloud, 2 sets of ships were converging on one dot of stubborn light at the edge of an abandoned map, and neither of them slept, and neither of them let go of the other's hand, and the dawn came up slow and pale and terrible and beautiful over the last outpost of Deepwell. They came from 2 doors in the sky, exactly as she'd said, and for one impossible hour, the silent outpost of Deepwell, dark for so long, forgotten by every map that mattered, became the center of everything. Her pursuers arrived first. Their ship came down out of the cold, clear quarter of sky without a sound, which Henry found deeply unfair. A thing that size had a moral obligation to at least hum. It settled over the ice fields near the wreck, and figures came across the plain toward the outpost. Unhurried, certain, the walk of people who had never once in their lives been told no. "They look confident," Henry said, watching through the window. "They are. Kevin's on it." Kevin was not on it. Kevin, three-legged and disappointing, took one look at the approaching ship and drove himself directly into a snowbank, where he remained, blinking apologetically, for the rest of the confrontation. Henry decided to interpret this as strategy. The pursuers did not knock. They didn't have to. Their leader's voice came through the console, through the walls, through Henry's own teeth, a cold, patient, reasonable voice, the worst kind, the kind that had already decided how this ended and was only calling to be polite about it. It spoke to Seraphina in her own settling ice language, and Henry couldn't follow the words, but he could follow the shape. "Come out, come back, be used. We have crossed a great deal of empty space, and we are not leaving without what is in your head," Seraphina answered. And here was the thing Henry finally understood, the thing the whole long ordeal had been building toward. The pursuers didn't want her. They wanted what she knew. The stars in her head, the true positions, the living roots, the dead lights, and where they really lay. That was the treasure, and she was merely the vault it was locked in. They had come across the dark, not for a woman, but for a map, so she gave it to them, all of it. She walked to the resurrected console, Henry's terrible, shouting, inelegant console, and she poured every star she carried into it, the corrected charts, the true sky, the knowledge no human hand could ever have drawn, and she flung it outward on the strongest signal Deepwell had ever thrown. Broadcast open and unencrypted across every lane in the system, human and otherwise, to anyone with ears to hear. "What are you doing?" said the cold voice, no longer quite so cold. "Making it worthless," Seraphina said in human words so Henry could hear. "You cannot own what everyone already has. You cannot silence a thing that has been shouted." She glanced sideways at Henry, dry as the dead star. "Your people were right about one thing. Sometimes you simply shout louder." Henry's whole chest did something complicated. The pursuers left. There was no grand battle, no last stand, only a long silence on the other end, the silence of people recalculating, and then the soundless ship lifting off the ice fields and climbing back through its door in the sky, because there was no longer any point. The vault had emptied itself into the open air. Seraphina was, for the first time in a very long time, not worth taking. Which was, Henry realized, precisely the point. She'd spent years being valuable. She had just, deliberately, made herself free. Then the second door opened and the human rescue came down. It was loud, and it was clumsy, and it hummed like it was supposed to, and Henry loved it a little for that. Officials in clean suits stepped out onto the ruined plane and offered him exactly what he'd wanted at the beginning of all this, back when he was a man who talked to a coffee machine because nothing else answered. A seat off the dying rock. Passage back to his own kind. Warmth, company, a future that didn't involve naming drones. Everything the brochures had once promised and finally, too late, delivered. He turned it down. The official blinked. "Sir, there is nothing left here. The colony's finished. There's no reason to stay." "There's one," Henry said. She was standing beside him, ice blue, long-eared, wound-heeled to a pale seam, watching him make the choice with an expression that said, plainly, that she had known he would make it before he had. That smirk. He'd have crossed the sky for that smirk. "You knew," he accused. "You sleep in a chair that faces my door," Seraphina said. "I have known for some time." I was guarding the door." "You were not guarding the door." The official was still talking, something about protocol, about there being nowhere for two people to go on an abandoned world, and Henry supposed that was technically true. Deepwell was dead. The colony was a graveyard, but the sky was full of Seraphina's stars now, every one of them named, every route drawn true, and a man who'd spent his whole life beneath them squinting at a wrong chart no longer had to. He had the corrected map. He had the woman who'd drawn it. He had, out past the 2 doors and the whole unwritten dark, more places to go than any brochure had ever promised. "We'll manage," Henry told the official. "I've got a working relay, 3 drones, and a coffee machine I intend to rebuild. His name's Gerald. It's a whole thing." The rescue ship left, humming, and the plane went quiet, and it was just the 2 of them again at the edge of the map, where it had started, except that at the start he'd dragged a wounded stranger from a wreck, meaning only to keep her breathing until someone came to take her away. Everyone had come. Both doors had opened. And the one thing Henry had refused, out of all of it, out of the whole enormous emptied sky, was her. "So," Seraphina said, looking up at her stars, "where would you like to go?" Henry took her hand. It wasn't the cold. It had never once been the cold. "Anywhere," he said. "You've got the map." The storm had lasted 3 weeks, and Henry had waited 9 months before that, and years before that still, a whole life spent squinting at a wrong map beneath a sky he thought he understood. And in the end, the thing that saved him wasn't the rescue he'd prayed for, or the colony he'd guarded, or the future the brochures had promised. It was a stranger who fell out of the sky and threatened him with a coffee machine, and who taught him that some of the lights we steer our whole lives by stopped shining a long time ago, and that the hardest, bravest thing a person can do is finally look up, notice which stars are dead, and choose a new one to follow. Because that was Henry's real journey. Not from a dying rock to the open sky, but from a man who mistook stubbornness for purpose into a man brave enough to admit what he actually wanted, and reach for it, out loud, in front of someone, with everything to lose. So let me leave you with the question the story left with me. What light are you still steering by, long after it's gone dark? What colony are you guarding out of habit, telling yourself it's noble, when the funeral ended a long time ago? And if 2 doors open in your sky tomorrow, one safe and certain, one terrifying and true, which one would you walk through? Sit with that. It's worth sitting with. The end. Friends, we've reached the end of Seraphina and Henry's story. Before we go, please don't forget to hit the like button as a reward for our efforts. Leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more stories. Goodbye, friends.